From the end of the American Revolution, commercial vessels of the young United States Republic were easy prey for pirates of the Barbary Coast. In 1801, newly inaugurated President Thomas Jefferson was eager to put an end to this threat and sent a squadron of observation to the Mediterranean. As the squadron arrived in Gibraltar, they learned that the bashaw of Tripoli had already declared war. On today's NASOH video and podcast, we're joined by designer of the new game, Shores of Tripoli, Kevin Bertram, for Fort Circle Games. The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASOH a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASOH was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Welcome to the North American Society for Oceanic History video podcast. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. The goal of the NASOH podcast is to bring you some of the best historians, professionals, and up-and-comers in the field of maritime history. On this holiday edition of the NASOH video podcast, we are branching out and diverging from our usual topics and guests to discuss a strategy game. We're heading to Washington, D.C., and being joined by Kevin Bertram. He's the founder and owner of Fort Circle Games. He's also the designer of a game we are going to be discussing today, The Shores of Tripoli, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps versus the Pirates of Tripoli. Welcome, Kevin, to the NASOH video podcast.
It's great to be here.
Well, Kevin, I'm excited to have you in here for a variety of reasons, not the least of which I am a huge war gamer. I've done this for a long time. I was weaned on Avalon Hill games. I've got a closet full of them. And probably one of my darkest memories I have was coming home from sailing as a merchant marine to my parents' house and finding out that half my games had been destroyed in a flood. It was just, it makes me mad to this day. You know,
I feel the pain for you.
Right, I know. I lost my entire squad leader series. It was terrible. It's just, it's an emotional tragedy. But one of the things that I am really excited about is literally a renaissance, I think, in strategy games that is going on. You know, there was a death, thought they were all going to go away with the advent of computers and no one would be doing strategy games at all. But one of the things we've seen recently is really the resurgence of those. So I was going to ask you to kind of really introduce yourself, give yourself a little bit of your background, what brought you into doing strategy games, and also talk a little bit about Fort Circle Games, which is the company that you created, and it's the publisher of the game we're going to be talking about today, To the Shores of Tripoli.
Sure. So I've actually been a gamer most of my life. I started gaming with my father when I was 6, and he wasn't the type of man to play Candyland. So we jumped straight off into Feudal and then Stratego and Risk and chess. And then when I was 12, I got Axis and Allies, and that was just a whole new world. And from there, I started playing Avalon Hill games, and I just always loved games. And then I went to college and I sort of fell away from it a little bit, and then you go in the workplace and, now I'm in my mid 40s and I'm like, I love history. I have an entrepreneurial spirit. Like, I think really I should do what I really always wanted to do, which was make board games. And so The Shores of Tripoli, I was kind of on the fence. And then I read a book about the First Barbary War and I'm like, this is a great story and there's no game on it. So I started reading other books and I'm like, this is a fantastic story. It makes a perfect game. This narrative is, it's heroic, it's daring, it's amazing, and there needs to be a game on it. And I kicked off by I started actually exactly 4 years ago. Tomorrow was the first play test I had for The Shores of Tripoli. And now the game is being released and we have lots of games coming up in the pipeline. And I could talk to you for probably 30 minutes on that alone. So I'll let you maybe hone your question a little better so I can be a little more informative for your listeners.
No, this is great. And you mentioned your background. So college-wise, were you a history major? Was this something that's always been a passion for you?
So it was kind of complicated. I wanted to be an engineering major because that's really where my interests were, but I was in college on a debate scholarship. And so with the travel time for debate, I couldn't really be an engineering student. So I studied history and philosophy. And that debate scholarship is a funny story because I was originally in the delayed entry program to be an enlisted Marine reserve, and that's how I was going to pay for college. And then I got this full ride scholarship to debate in college, and my recruiter's like, "You're an idiot if you got to get out of the program and go debate at college." So this strange debate scholarship really did kind of turn, how about 8 or 10 years of my life went. But yeah, even from the earliest on, I mean, I loved history, and so that was what I studied at college, was history and philosophy, with maybe an eye towards law school, but I'm glad I didn't do that.
One of the things we love to talk about at NASOH, the North American Society for Oceanic History, is different ways that history can be applied, and we're very interdisciplinary. So one of the things that we talk about a lot in our organization is using history, using archaeology, using a lot of material culture. And one of the things I think that's not used enough is simulations to be able to understand historical events and apply those historical events into the common knowledge. And so one of the things I love to do in my teaching is to bring in historical simulations and to get tactile with the students, to get out of the lecture, the PowerPoints, and really lay out a board and show them how things happen. And so your game you came out with the Shores of Tripoli, which is what we're going to talk about here, is a really an interesting game. Number one, let me compliment you on a beautifully designed game. I'm fortunate as Kevin. I had discussions with Kevin beforehand. He was able to get me a copy of the game. I've been playing it with my 12-year-old son. I enjoy it. Let me just again compliment. Number one, the box is like one of the most sturdiest boxes I ever had. I one of the critiques I have of older games is they just fall apart after a while. Every one of my old games is wrapped with tape and kind of holding together there. But this is a really beautiful game, and I think as a designer, I'm really interested in your philosophy of how you went about designing, because you have a lot of options when you design a strategic game. Do you get down in the weeds? Do you make this really accurate to the point of losing playability, or do you go for playability, at which point you have to kind of get rid of some of the accuracy to make this more open? Do you market this for people who love this topic entirely and will only buy it, or do you go for a more general audience crowd? So give me your idea on the philosophy of developing this game.
Sure. So the philosophy in this game, and the philosophy of all the games that we'll be publishing, is I want to be able to play the game with my 11-year-old daughter. I want to be able to play it with my wife. I want to be able to play it with my father-in-law, who went to the Naval Academy. And then I want to play it with my Jason Matthews, who is one of the best game designers, Twilight Struggle, Imperial Struggle, 1960. So I want to be able to play a game where it makes sense that that's an enjoyable experience along that broad range of potential opponents. So that means the base core rules have to be understandable, that I can explain to someone fairly young. But at the same time, there needs to be enough strategy within. So like there's really critical hard choices if you're playing against another skilled opponent that really force you to consider what you're going to do on your limited number of turns. The First Barbary War is interesting also because there was really limited resources that the United States had. I mean, we started off with a very small squadron, kind of grew over time, and we're trying to put out fires here and there. And so I really wanted for the Americans to evoke that sense of, I have too much to do and not enough men and material to do it. And I think that comes through in the game. And then I also wanted to make sure that there was a strong educational element in it, that it really did. You could play this game once or twice and walk away and know a lot more about the conflict. And that's sort of a larger philosophical question of some people learn by lecture, some people learn by reading, some people learn by watching documentaries. Different people have different learning styles, but one learning style that I think at least a lot of people can relate to is sitting down, making the decisions, understanding the viewpoint of the protagonists in the battle. And I think Shores of Tripoli does a pretty good job of that, if I might say so.
No, I think you hit a very interesting balance, and it's one of the things I liked about the game a lot. Like I said, I've played those games where it's, man, it is historically accurate to the point when it's almost unmanageable, that it becomes very difficult to do this. And in some ways you abstract this with, you have American frigates, but we're not identifying the frigates. And like you said, you do get that image at the beginning. It's like, man, I don't have anything in this American player here to do. I can't handle this because the playing field is so large. You're dealing with the entire Mediterranean. You're dealing with this vast expanse, and there's a lot of elements in here. And what's interesting too is you have a lot of the things that historians know happen. There's luck. I mean, there's rolls of the dice. There's you don't know which way this is going to go, but at the same time, you include the cards, which again, I think is always a great idea, because here's those little elements of history that are thrown in there. And I was never a big fan of card games in board games initially, and then I realized after playing a few and getting into them that they provide really a interesting element to it, because it is so historical. It is, you're really kind of driven in. And one of the things that I noticed, and this was with playing with my son, was as you play a card, he'll ask about, okay, was that true? Did that really happen? It's like, oh yeah, as I explained to him, how Decatur, boarded the Philadelphia to burn it, and one of the most daring acts of the age, all of a sudden now you're laying that out there for him, and which I found really interesting and fun way to do this, because again, it's a game that you're trying to win, so you got your objectives, you're trying to, be your pirate and get your coins. Well, at the same time, you're the Americans trying to prevent, this. You're dealing with issues front and back, all the time. And so it plays out really well, and I think that's a lot of fun with it. Let's talk about the history. You mentioned before that you got interested in the topic, because again, there's a lot of things you could have chosen to do your first game on. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that background. I mentioned in pulling up the images for this slide, you had a great kind of library and literature there on the Barbary pirates, and I can remember in grad school doing a historiography paper on the Barbary Pirate War, and this is back in the 90s. And ever since then, it's blown up even more. You've got front and center there a book by B.J. Armstrong, who's one of the council members at NASOH.
Excellent book, by the way.
It's a great book. It's absolutely a fantastic book. We enjoy it a lot. Matter of fact, it was a winner of a Lyman Prize this year from NASOH. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history behind it, the background, and what provoked you about it and what you liked about it.
Sure. So part of this answer is going to disappoint you because it's a commercial answer, in that because there's no game on the First Barbary War, I knew there would be interest, right? If I made a game about the Battle of the Bulge, there are 50 games about the Battle of the Bulge.
You're exactly right.
I hate to admit that there was a commercial aspect to it, but I also like there were certain key events that were fascinating. The Swedes are our allies in the beginning of the war, and then they get frustrated because we're not taking it very seriously, so they just pay Tripoli off and leave. Obviously, the whole events around the Philadelphia, both Tripoli capturing it and then the United States going in and setting it on fire. The battle at Dern, which makes its way into Marine Corps lore. There's these key points that are just a fascinating narrative that you can read about and a lot of people enjoy, but some people like to be able to play that actually out. And you have a card for Presley O'Bannon who helps you capture Dern. I mean, that's a great way to kind of get that integrated feel about how people and events interfaced and really, changed the course of history. So it's just, it's like this particular war, it was like drew me like a moth to a flame. I just couldn't say no to it. So,
well, I would argue that the commercial aspect that you mentioned doesn't put me off at all, because one of the things I would talk about as a historian, and particularly, is some topics are so written about that others get neglected, and I think that's something that you did here, is you filled an area that is neglected. We talk about this in history all the time. Is there's no topic in history that's not new, and it's not true, because some things have not been studied and not been brought out into the public venue, and sometimes it takes a popular historian, for example, to bring light to a topic that's been written about 50 times. I can give you a popular history of the Barbary Pirate War written by someone, and I can put 20 books against it that have been written by historians, and they don't get anywhere near the attention. But no, I think that's a great one to do it. And I think, again, your history element here is so important, because again, as a historian, I can appreciate it as I'm pulling cards and I'm playing cards in this game. There's the history element right there. There is the Presley O'Banion. There it's, oh, it's Morocco. I gotta go deal with Morocco all of a sudden, which was true. I mean, it's exactly true. You got the personalities of the squadrons. You got, the personalities of the leaders at this time, and you always have that kind of, what's the overall objective. It's a tough game to win for a variety of reasons, because it involves not a clear-cut victory. You can't just go in and destroy Tripoli. I mean, as much as you want to, you can't do that, because that's not what the victory is. And so talk to me about your process. How do you go about designing a game like this? I've never designed a game. I've played lots of them, but I never get into that idea of, okay, here's a historical story. Let me turn this into something playable, because I'm not going to lie to you, Kevin. I'd be lost at trying to put this together.
Well, so this is the process I use, and I don't say this is a recommended process, but it's just what works for me. Is I read, usually I would consider 2, 3, 4 core books, hopefully that come at the topic from a little bit of a different perspective. That's what I've done for the Halls of Montezuma, which is on the Mexican-American War, and out of that draw out, the most important thing is, what were the core goals of the antagonists, right? So what did Tripoli want? What did the United States want out of this battle? And that shapes what the victory conditions are. And then from that, I really like using cards, because I think it's an easier way to tell the story, and there's narrative arc to the conflict. So then I literally make a list of all of the events that I think make sense. Okay, what are those events in terms of the card play or the gameplay? How would they affect the gameplay? And then just throw together 27 cards for each side and start testing it. And sometimes a card will be broken, or it doesn't make sense, or you can never play it. And through pretty extensive play testing, you find out what works and what doesn't. I had over 350 people play test the Shores of Tripoli, which was, it's a pretty big undertaking and then you're integrating all this data, and you want to not take everyone's input to heart, because I mean you need to keep a clear goal of what you want to do in the game, but yet if you continue to hear certain responses from people about how it plays, you're like, all right, maybe this card isn't adequately being representing the history, or maybe it's breaking the game to where the game isn't fun, so how do we massage that? And that's just a process. And then I'm blessed with some great graphic designers and some amazing public art that existed from the time period. So you have the cards up there now. I just think they're gorgeous. I mean, I hate to, I'm supposed to be humble, but I love it, the cards. And if you feel them, they're made of a nice linen finish. And it's just like, I don't know, I think it's really a cool thing to hold in your hand and play. And it's better than playing on a computer. So
No, I would agree with you on that. I think again, I think the game is beautifully designed. Like I said, it is picturesque in many ways, and I think it hides its simplicity in how well you design this game, because it's not in many ways it's not simple. It's intricate. There's strategy, there's things you want to play with, and again, I think the cards provide you those little historical tidbits and everything. I know when I first opened it and I looked at the cards, one of my initial things was to, okay, let me put these in order, let me figure out when these events happen, because the historian in me kind of kicks in. And I like the idea that the events are there, but as a historian, all right, if you gave me this game in a chronological order and I had to play these things chronologically, I know what's going to happen. All right, I know the end. That's always the hardest thing.
That's not a game,
right? That's the hardest thing in history, I would argue too, Kevin, is when you teach history, is the end of the story. It's hard to put drama into World War II. We're going to beat the Nazis. It's hard to put that drama in. But if you're in 1941, 1942, it's not that clear. And I think that's one of the things that simulations and strategy games allow you to do. It's almost not counterfactual, but you don't know when things are going to happen. And what I like about the game that you design is you have those historical events that are going to happen. You just don't know what order they're going to happen in. Because you're going to run.
And we actually do have a couple counterfactual cards in the game, because the United States, the way we historically won the game is we signed a peace treaty, so they would stop raiding and we didn't have to pay tribute Of course, they broke it a few years later, but that was a win at the time. But I gave the American player the option to actually try to send in all the Marines and capture Tripoli. So you put a few counterfactual cards in there, but then you highlight that in the historical booklet and say, now these things didn't happen, but it allows you to explore a what if scenario, which, I understand might slightly detract from the historical value, but I think it also makes it a more compelling, more engaging game to play. So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I think about those kind of like how much counterfactual should you have in a game?
No, I think, and I think that's a really important element, because again, if the game was designed so that only the Americans can win, it's not fun. Who wants to play that game? But again, if you play this again, and the Corsairs can win versus the U.S., then okay, now you have a game, and now that's real life too, because you don't know the way this is going to end up. And again, I want to go back to the way you lay this out. Again, I think it plays very interestingly. Again, you could gotten way down in the weeds and really made this very intricate and start controlling, what ships arrive and not. But again, you put this into a very interesting area that it's general. You have these large, patrol areas. You get down in the ports. You have, in this case, you see the Swedish and American frigates off of Tripoli doing the blockade, which seems like, okay, well, Tripoli doesn't have a chance here. This is real easy. But again, all the pirate player has to do is play a card, and all of a sudden he's got to worry about issues behind him. Things come up that all of a sudden change that. And again, I'm really interested in how you figured that out and really came up. I mean, what was your time for starting the game, and how long did it take to get it to where you're at today with the game available for purchase?
Sure. Well, like I say, the first playtest happened on December 15th in 2016, and I'd been doing reading for about 3 months prior, 4 months prior, and putting together cards and the idea. And this will sound odd, but like I would literally like lay in bed and close my eyes and think about, if this side plays a card, then this side plays a card, like what's the reaction to be in, and like playing it through in my head, which is better than counting sheep for a way to fall asleep, by the way. And then that gave me kind of a rough idea. And then those first play tests were rough. There's a card, for example, in the game called Storms, and it can hurt the United States, and you can lose one of your frigates. But in the original version, it could wipe out the entire squadron. And we're like, all right, that doesn't work. That's overpowered. And so it's just an iterative process through playtesting and continually working, and then taking it out and having it a check. I was lucky that several authors of those books actually played the game with me during the process and were able to, comment on if this seems realistic, if this doesn't seem realistic. And, that was really, to be honest, very gratifying, very helpful. And so, but that process just continues to go on, and you fine tune the cards until you think that the balance is right. I still to this day have people say the Americans win too easily, and I have people who say the Tripolitans win too easy. And I think I've probably found the right balance if there's a few people on each side of that discussion. So
I was interested in another aspect, which I think you've done a great job with, and that's your social media aspect. One of the things that I particularly enjoy is the fact that you're out there on social media, and I just saw the other day that you offered a copy of the game to Ian Toll, the author of Six Frigates,
yeah,
and
you took it too. I'm really
and well, I
happy
know he
about
did,
that.
and that's Ian right there, and he grabbed up on that, and I think that's great, because again, one of the things that you're doing is connecting something with a historical work. Six Frigates has been largely lauded as one of the best works on the early U.S. Navy. It's on a list from the U.S. Navy, as recommended reading. It's interesting to me that okay, here's a historical simulation that kind of looks at a particular element of Six Frigates right there. And again, when you get Ian, all of a sudden tweeting about it, putting it out there, saying something about it, you get that information out there on a historical topic. And a lot of historians will absolutely just trash movies. There's just historical movies are terrible. They just don't depict things. I'm a mixed metaphor on that. I think if it gets somebody interested, they want to pick up a book and read more on it, that's a great thing.
The
And
the
one of
first movie I remember seeing was Midway, and I was 6 years old, and I remember very clearly walking out of, and it was after midnight because it was such a long movie, and we'd went to the late movie. But after that, like, I was voraciously read about Midway, and I can still to this day what, the order the Japanese carriers sank in, and like everything that's going, like, and that's from watching a movie when I was 6. And now, did I get all of that from the movie? No, but yeah, if it spurs interest, like, yeah, I'm a big fan. But yeah, I also, I see the historical inaccuracies in movies and it makes you cringe. So I feel you on that.
It does, but again, I find, one of the things I've found as a historian is historical inaccuracies in books, and that's one of
Yeah.
the reasons why we write, books about the same topic that we get a lot of, we get kind of criticized about, because, hey, there's new research, there's new things, use the Midway analogy for you. I remember reading, I can't remember tell you how many times I've read books on Midway, to the point that I could not read another book on Midway until Shattered Sword came out, and all of a sudden it just changed my
Fantastic
view.
book.
Right, changed
Yeah.
my absolute view on Midway, and I think that's something you did. One of the things you include in the game, which I think is really important here, is, again, you have a beautiful, rules of the game. The rules of the game are great. It's beautiful right there. It's very small. It's easy to read. One of the things I think that people don't appreciate about board games today, that I find extremely useful, is a lot of YouTube playthroughs that allow you to watch a turn of the game being played. Sometimes one of the things that turned a lot of people off from board games is the intricate rules, and not being able to, play the game. I realized I played the game wrong for years. All of a sudden somebody would tell you, no, that's not the way you do it. And it changes the play of the game. But now you have those YouTube things, but you also included a historical supplement, which kind of, talks about the history of the game, which I thought was great. You have that in there. And again, here's a little bit of that history lesson for you. What made you want to include that in there?
Well, part of it is I really believe in the educational value in games. And part of it was a little bit of a commercial decision in that. So, for example, in The Shores of Tripoli, Abby Mullen, who has a book coming out on the First Barbary Wars in 2022, she's a professor at George Mason. I went to her and I'm like, I think that this game would benefit if it had an essay in it that helped give context to these cards, because we don't explain them in that detail. And while certainly we would love people to then go read a book, it'd be nice if there was, a 2,000-3,000 word essay that could cover it, and so give people a fuller understanding and just enjoy the game more. And she said sure, and you see it in there, and it worked out great. And I also wanted to include a couple original documents or primary documents. The only thing we ended up putting in The Shores of Tripoli was the letter that Jefferson sent to Yusuf Karamanli about the squadron of observation, which was sort of moot because they had already declared war on us by the time he had written it. But I think that kind of thing draws people in and interests them. Yeah, there's the letter there. And so I think that's a trend that we're going to continue doing. I'm really lucky for the companion game, the Halls of Montezuma. Amy Greenberg, who she's a professor at Penn State who wrote A Wicked War. She wrote the biography of Sarah Polk, and she's the president of the Society for the History of the Early American Republic. She wrote the historical essay for Halls of Montezuma. And, that's really nice that big name historians are now seeing the value in using this as, I don't want to say bringing history to the masses, because that's a little weirdly titled, but making it more accessible and making history more interesting. And I think this is the way to do it. So yeah.
No, I give you a big shout out to Abby Mullen. We're a big fan of her Console Prize podcast, and the
My
consoles
sticker's here somewhere. So
yeah, the consoles play such a big role in the game, and I mean, and the consoles are in the game. I mean, you have elements.
Consoles in this game, and the consoles in Shores in Montezuma too. Yeah. So
and I think that's another great element about it is it's not just frigates against gunboats. It's strategy. There's political elements here. There's diplomatic elements here, and again, in the microcosm, you get a very interesting play in an area that most Americans don't know we were involved in early in our history. We're talking about 1800. You get the timeline right there from 1801, 1805. It's Thomas Jefferson, who's usually identified as the pacifist, is really leading one of these first overseas wars where American flags are being raised over, cities far away from the United States. And it's kind of also a war where in the very end we kind of screw our ally over, and
Oh, totally.
you can make the argument. It's like, man, this is like we still do this today, and it's just, and it seems like almost an impossible war. And sometimes it's like, man, we're in this war for 4 or 5 years. Well, we've been in war for 20 years now, and it's interesting to see how you play that out. I enjoyed the elements you brought into it. I think number one, it's a great gift item for anyone during this holiday season, because again, it introduces maritime history, an element of maritime history in there that's really unique. It opens up for many people out there topics that don't get commonly discussed. You get a great little bibliography in there for suggested books and readings and everything. I know you finally have the games in play in the United States. Let's talk about that for a second, because one of the interesting things about this game was this is a game about blockades. It's a game about it's a game about global trade. The Tripolitans are trying to harass American trade. You were kind of a victim of this yourself in getting the game. I wonder if you could talk about it for a second, Kevin.
Sure.
It's an interesting story.
It wasn't as exciting as Pirates or anything.
No.
But obviously the game was originally set to release in April, and obviously the pandemic slowed down the production. The game is produced in China. And so in mid-September, the games finally were ready to ship. Now in China, there's a holiday, Golden Week. So they didn't ship for the first week of October. So then our games to Europe shipped fine, and they received them at the end of October. Everyone in Europe got their game. But the ship games for the United States. So on the 7th, they're put in a truck and taken to the port in Yantian, where they then sit for 10 days because there's a traffic jam. And then they finally do get put on a boat. And then for some reason, they're taken off in Busan, South Korea, and then picked up on another boat 2 weeks later. No reason why, just by the by. So the shipment finally landed in Jacksonville on last Saturday at like 11:57 at night, and then they left the port on this Tuesday. So it was kind of I have 5,000 games that I'm trying to get here so I can sell, and it was a little bit of a hairy process. I'm really lucky. The way I'd originally funded the game partially was through something called Kickstarter, which, if you're not aware, is a crowdfunding source. So people got a little bit of a discount, but they know they get the game first. And so, those people have been very patient because I told them they'd have their game in April. Now, a pandemic, everyone understands, but I'd like people to get their game. So now everybody's finally getting their game. So that's good.
I've been following you and the voyage of your games to the United States. So I know you were relieved. I could tell that with the arrival of the ship in Jacksonville for it. You mentioned a few other games. What's coming down the pike for Fort Circle Games? What are some games that you have beyond this that would be of interest to our viewers, especially those with a historical background?
Sure. Well, all of our games are historical. Not all of them. We'll see I don't know what people's interest might be. So our next game is actually called Votes for Women. It was designed by a friend of mine, Tori Brown, who's a political consultant here in Washington, D.C., and I did the development on it. And it follows the women's suffrage movement, and the battle is over either the ratification or the rejection of the 19th Amendment. So it starts in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention and runs till 1920, and each side are playing cards to try and get influence in states. And for the amendment to pass, they need 3/4 of the states, or 36 states, to pass, whereas the opposition only needs to stop 13. We have rules where you can play cooperatively against the opposition, or you can play competitively, or you can play solitaire as well. Then we have, I'm working on a game with a friend of mine, Gilberto Lopez, called the Halls of Montezuma, which is an obvious companion game for the Shores of Tripoli. It maybe takes about 15 minutes longer to play because there's a political phase in the game. So the American player is really the Polk administration, and the Mexican player is both the Mexican military, but also the anti-war movement in the United States. And someone said this seems almost like a 19th century Vietnam, and there's some semblance of that to the way the game is designed. Jason Matthews, my good friend, has designed a game on the treason trial of Aaron Burr called the United States versus Aaron Burr, and that's a legal game where Jefferson again is very involved in the treason trial of his former vice president, who, although he shot Hamilton, that's not what he's on trial for. He went out west and was maybe going to become emperor of Mexico, or we're not really sure what he was up to, but Jefferson wanted him tried for treason. I don't know if I should spoil it, but Burr does get off and isn't found guilty of treason. But the cast of characters in that is amazing. The Chief Justice is riding circuit, and so he's the trial judge down in Richmond. The foreman of the jury is a former governor of Virginia. It's just it's an amazing cast of characters in that. And then we have a game on the history of the Supreme Court that's coming out by Talia Rosen. And then in 2022, we have a game called Great Cities, Washington, D.C., and it follows the growth of Washington, D.C., and that's designed by myself and Jan Day, who's a D.C. native. There's not many of them here in town, so that's what we have up on tap.
No, I'm looking forward to all of them. I'm matter of fact, you got me playtesting Halls of Montezuma, so I'm looking forward to that. I haven't had a chance yet, just finished grading, so I'm looking forward to getting that out and playing that with my son. Shores of Tripoli, fantastic game. Again, you can play the solitaire, you can play it 1 to 2 players, about a 45-60 minute play time, about an hour to play. It is really a lot of fun. I am looking forward to using it in my maritime history class. I'm envisioning a game with my students, let them play and kind of divide them up between pirates and the U.S. and let them go at it and see. I'll tell them their grade depends on it, so that should put some.
I do want to let you know, once the pandemic subsides, we're actually going to have a tournament here in Washington, D.C., and you need a 4-person team. So if you want to take your best students and bring them up, and
there you go,
compete against the Naval Academy and the Coast Guard Academy and Georgetown University, and the women of Fort Circle will have a team. So,
well, and one of the big things right now is and you mentioned that is so many institutions are really doing. The military has got a resurgence in wargaming. Sebastian Bay over at the Krulak Center has been doing that. We saw the introduction of wargaming back at the U.S. Naval Academy recently. A good buddy of mine, Claude Burbet, and hosted that.
Yep.
And we saw that being
all friends of the firm.
Right. And I think, again, it allows you to learn history in a different way. We're very big on experiential learning, getting out there, and there's a tactile element to it, feeling the board, feeling the pieces. And, when you lose a little piece of cardboard, sometimes it's emotional, and all of a sudden you lose something. And now all of a sudden, the game tips. And I think there's something to be said for that. I really want to compliment you on the game, Kevin. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
And I appreciate you coming on and talking about it. And hopefully we'll be able to get you some more sales out of this. So, Kevin, why don't you extend to our listeners how they can get the game? What's the best way to find you on the internet and on social media?
Sure. So if you want to find me on social media, I'm fairly active on Twitter. It's just Fort Circle is my username. There's also a Facebook group, the Fort Circle official group. You can find us by there. We're not quite as active there. That's more for almost like we're issuing press releases or letting people know of major events. If you would like to purchase the game, unfortunately, it won't be on Amazon until January, but we are selling it through our site right now. And you can either go to fortcircle.com or fortcirclestore.com. Either of those will work. And the game is $66, which includes free shipping. But if you use the code NASOH, you get $6 off. And because I'm a member, I'll also kick an extra $6 for every game when I make my membership payment. So help out the organization and help me out too.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate that. We use a lot of funds and money to go for graduate students for their research, to look into coming to our conference, which is going to be held this year down in Pensacola in 2021, and then in Wilmington in 2022 in North Carolina. So I want to take a moment and thank our guest, Kevin Bertram, for joining us for our NASOH video podcast. We'll have a link to Fort Circle Games and to the shores of Tripoli in the show notes. If you liked our video podcast, be sure to click on YouTube and give it a 5 stars on the podcast provider. Please subscribe to our channel to receive updates as we continue to interview maritime historians and players in the maritime field. You can follow NASOH on Facebook or on Twitter at NASOH_history. The best way to follow NASOH is to become a member. As such, you'll receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, The Northern Mariner, which we publish with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. Go to www.nasoh.org and click on membership to join. And I encourage you to go to www.fortcircle.com and go ahead and order your copy of Shores of Tripoli. Until our next talk, keep sailing and watch out for pirates.